Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Enrique Levine, co-founder and VP of Product at Zintro. Zintro is a global online marketplace that helps connect companies with highly specialized consultants and other expertise providers for projects that range from one-hour phone consults to multi-month on-site engagements and even full-time jobs. Today's webinar, Formulating a Successful Regulatory Strategy, will be presented by Zintro expert Parul Chansoria, founder and CEO of Elexes. Parul is an experienced RAC and ICH GCP certified regulatory affairs professional with a bachelor's in biomedical engineering and a master's in bioengineering from the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's also a certified quality auditor by the American Society of Quality. At the early stage of her career, Parul worked in medical device R&D, where she built a micro device that created hypoxia in heart muscle cells and facilitated the study of heart activity during ischemia. From R&D, Parul moved to regulatory to utilize her medical device design, development, and testing experience and in-depth knowledge of regulatory affairs for bringing innovative medical devices to market. As a regulatory professional, Parul advised many companies on bringing their devices to the US and international markets and on maintaining compliance of existing devices for patient safety. Parul has worked with big and small US and UK-based medical device companies like Stryker, Intuitive Surgical, UPL Distribution, etc. on capital equipment, software, and single-use and reusable devices. She has worked with dialysis equipment, robotic and minimally invasive surgical devices, laser and radiological devices, and other diagnostic and therapeutic devices. We will include a couple of poll questions throughout the webinar, so stay tuned to interact with us a little bit. If you would like to ask Parul any specific questions throughout the webinar, feel free to use the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. If you don't see it, on the top right corner of your screen, there's a little orange arrow you can click, and that will open it up, and you will see the questions section. Feel free to use it anytime throughout the webinar. Parul will be responding to these questions after the presentation, so stay tuned. We will provide Parul's contact information, her Zintro profile, so you can reach out to her and start a conversation with her for follow-ups, so stay tuned. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our presenter, Parul Chansoria.
Thank you, Enrique, for the introduction. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Today, we are going to talk about formulating a successful regulatory strategy. This presentation is focused for medical devices, and I would like to go into different things that people need to take into account when formulating a regulatory strategy. So you must have definitely come across this word regulatory strategy quite often. What does really regulatory strategy mean? It's like a formal document that aligns regulatory goals with company goals, and it provides definition and direction to the project team. So there are a cross-functional team of people that are involved in formulating a regulatory strategy. Everyone gives their input from their area of expertise and finally formulates a regulatory strategy. What is the importance of regulatory strategy? So as you know that regulations are constantly changing, and in this dynamic environment, it's very important to have a thought-through regulatory plan in place before you actually start executing your regulatory steps in order to bring your device to the market. So this definitely lessens the completion time of the regulatory submission. It has a huge impact in every stage, whether it's pre-market stage or post-market stage. It is, of course, very efficient for product development, and a thought-through regulatory strategy will save you a lot of time in the long run. So what really are the key factors for formulating a successful regulatory strategy? I would say that two factors are most important. First is the target market. Second is the product life cycle stage. When going into the target market, there are several things to take into account. First is indications for use and intended use. So once you decide your target market, like whether you want to enter into the Chinese market first, or you want to go into the US or Europe or India or any other country for that matter, you should go into deciding other things like the indications for use, what are the risks associated with your device, what is the classification of your device, and what is the import-export status of your device in that particular country. And why do I say that target market is really important in formulating a strategy? That's because every country has their own set of regulations and rules and requirements, and each of those rules requirements need to be taken into account when launching a new product into that particular country. So once you decide your target market, that will play a very important role in your strategy. Second is product life cycle stage. So whether your product is in pre-market stage or in post-market stage, that has a lot to do with what type of requirements it's going to be subject to. So definitely take into account these two things. And we will go into each of these one by one, and you can get a better understanding, a better feel of what I'm trying to explain here. Let's have our first poll question here.
Okay, so the question is, what is the most important part of formulating a regulatory strategy? Please take a second to respond to this question. The options are indication for use, target market, competent personnel, or all of the above. We're going to give a few seconds for our audience to respond. We really appreciate your participation. Okay, almost 80% of our attendees have responded. Last chance to put your responses in. Chris, I think we can close the poll, and I'm going to read the results out loud. So 43% said all of the above, 43% said target market, and then the smaller ones, indications for use, at 9%, and competence personnel, 4%. Back to you, Parul.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So yes, I would say that all of the above is the most suitable one in this case, because yes, target market is one of the important factors in determining or in formulating a successful strategy, but also competent personnel are important so that they can make the right choices at the right stage and help the company formulate strategy which has been formulated after taking into account everything from every aspect of the product. So whether it's clinical aspect or from the R&D standpoint, so everything needs to be taken into account when formulating the strategy. So I would say option D, all of the above, is the correct one. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, so today we're going to talk about some of the target markets. What are the regulations in the US? What are the regulations in Europe, European Union, India, China, and Canada? So these are the countries that we are going to cover briefly today. So in the US, in order to bring product to the market, of course, most of you would know that you need to get an FDA approval or FDA clearance. And FDA's role is to make sure that the product that comes to the market is safe and effective for the human use. So, and they do that by asking people to submit 510K submissions or PMA submissions or any other type of submission, which is a written application that describes your technology to the FDA. FDA reviews it and makes a determination whether or not the product is suitable for human use. And of course, they will ask for a lot of supporting data for the claims that you make, for the indications for use that you give. So all that goes in a package format to the FDA. The original device is not sent to them, just the written description of the device. So in US, typically 3 classes. Class 1, the lowest risk devices. Class 2, which are a little bit higher risk devices, and Class 3, which are the highest risk devices. So it's a risk-based classification, and different type of controls are applicable for different classes of devices. General controls are applicable to Class 1, special controls to Class 2 and Class 3. Also, the Class 1 devices, most of them would not need a 510K submission, whereas Class 2 would need a 510K. Some of the Class 1s would also need 510K, but some are exempt. Even some of the Class 2 are exempt. So all that determination is made more based on the regulations that are in place. Recently, FDA also released a long list of devices that will now be exempt from 510K requirements. So it's best to stay on top of the changing regulations, so you can always take into account the things that FDA is updating, and take that into account for your regulatory strategy. So as I mentioned earlier, 510K is required for Class 2, PMA for Class 3. HTE is a special kind of application that's done for products that are meant to be used by a very limited population or patient population in the US. So the target patient population is really small, and FDA allows companies to do HTE submission. EAP is expedited access pathway. In this, under this type of submission, FDA allows companies to market products very quickly to the end user, and this is typically for those types of devices that are solving a unique medical problem. So if your device is solving a unique medical problem, you might want to look into expedited access pathway program. So of course, depending on the device classification, it's necessary to determine whether you would be pursuing a 510K, PMA, or any other type of application, and that has a lot to do with what type of testing you will be subject to, your device has to perform, and what type of requirements the device has to comply with. So all these things can be determined only after you can determine the type of application that you would pursue. So definitely formulating a strategy early on in the submission process or in the development process is a good strategy. Let's look at poll question 2.
Okay, so question 2 is, can a medical device have more than one predicate, sorry. And the options are yes, absolutely, no, definitely not, only Class 2, or only Class 3. I'm going to give a couple of seconds here to let our audience respond. Thanks everyone for your participation. Helps us make this a little more interactive. Okay, most of our attendees have responded. I think we can close the poll. So the responses were 63% of the audience believes yes, absolutely, 19% only Class 2, 13% only Class 3, and 6% says no, definitely not.
Thank you, Chris. So we would say that first option is correct. Yes, definitely. And I didn't really talk about predicate device because it's a long discussion in itself. 510K submission requires that your subject device that you're trying to bring to the market is compared to a predicate device. And you can definitely have more than one predicate device as long as you can compare your indications for use and technological characteristics to that predicate device. So more than one predicate device is definitely a possible scenario. Let's look at the next poll question.
Okay. So the question is, a new medical device has been designed However, a similar device doesn't exist in the market. So for FDA approval, should a PMA sub, would you mind completing the question there?
Sure. Should a PMA submission be made, or should other type of submission should be pursued? So it just says, should a PMA submission be pursued?
And so the options are no, we can file a 510K instead, or it depends on the case, or yes, PMA submission is indispensable, or pre-submission. We're going to give a couple more seconds to let everyone vote. And I think we can close the poll question. So this is basically the standing of our audience, that 47% believe it depends, 33% say yes, PMA submission is indispensable, 13% say pre-submission, and 7% say 510K instead. Back to you, Parul.
Thank you. So great audience. I mean, like, definitely it depends. So if there is not a closest predicate, it depends, because sometimes you can leverage a similar device technological characteristics and indications for use, and you might be falling under the intended use category of a similar competitor device. So it's definitely worth trying out other types of devices that are existing in the market. So pre-submission is a route that you could take to have an open dialogue with the FDA, because it's possible that you did not consider some of the devices that might be under which you might fall under the blanket category of those types of devices. So it's important to consider all those things and take it into account. So I would say that yes, it depends. So even if there is not a predicate device or a closest competitor, it's not the right way to just go ahead with the PMA. Definitely check out your options and see what other devices you might be falling similar to. So it's definitely worth the research. Okay, I think I have a couple of more poll questions later. So let's go on and discuss about CE marking. So CE marking is required for European market, and it helps in establishing that your product is of high quality and it's safe and effective for human use. However, for Europe, they pay more attention on safety. Yes, efficacy is important too, but FDA is like, they really want to understand the safety and efficacy, and whereas in the Europe, they are more concerned about the safety. So in Europe, there are typically four classes: Class 1, Class 2A, 2B, and 3. Under Class 1 would be, of course, very low-risk devices, same kind of classification, higher risk, Class 2A, then 2B, and Class 3. So devices that are measuring and are sterile will be regulated by the notified body. So notified body is the regulatory body in Europe that would audit companies and check for conformity to ISO 13485, that is the quality system regulations, and they will check a technical file or other technical documentation in order to give the company an approval and let them sell into Europe. So notified body intervention will happen only with Class 2A, 2B, Class 3, and Class 1 devices that have measuring function or that are sterile. So if your product is a Class 1, it doesn't have a measuring function, and it is not sterile, then you might just be able to self-certify for a CE mark. So these are the different directives that are applicable in Europe for medical device, for active implantable, and for IVDs. So depending on your type of device, you would want to follow that particular directive. So if you're formulating your regulatory strategy, you need to take this into account. Early on, you should know what type of regulations, what type of directives will apply to you so that you can incorporate all the requirements in your product development. So as I mentioned earlier, class 1 that has no measuring function or no sterile function, that would be carried out by manufacturer alone, and they can self-certify to it. So the CE mark wouldn't have any number. You might have seen CE mark has a number at the bottom that shows that the CE has been given by a notified body, and if it doesn't have any number, that means it's self-certified CE marking. Then class 1 that have sterile or a measuring function, they would require intervention of a notified body, and similar is the case with class 2B and class 3. So let's look at poll question 5.
Okay, so the question is, what class does a blood glucose meter fall under? Class 1, Class 2, or Class 3? I'm going to wait a little bit to let everyone get their chance. Okay, thank you everyone for participating. I think we can close the poll. And so the responses were 88% say Class 2, 13% say Class 3, and no one said Class 1. Back to you.
Thank you. So that's absolutely correct. So this class 1, 2, and 3 is per the FDA. It was just like a review question that we wanted to go over. So class 2 is the correct answer, and they are a medium risk device. So that's why they are categorized under the class 2. So let's move on to health. TPD or Health Canada is actually the regulatory body that requires all manufacturers who want to bring their product into Canadian market. They require for them to submit a medical device license application, and of course Canada has its own regulations, but many things can be leveraged from other countries and used for Canadian submissions. So for example, if you do a 510K submission in US, you can leverage a lot of that information that you prepare for your 510K for Canadian submission. Similarly, you can leverage a lot of things that you do for the European submission for the Canadian. So a lot of information can be leveraged, and one thing which you should know is that Canadian regulatory body also requires to comply with quality systems, which is very similar to ISO 13485, which is required by the European regulatory body. So those things need to be taken into account, of course, when formulating a strategy, because if you do want to target Canada as a market, then you should look at the differences that exist between US, Canada, Europe, and other countries, and make sure that you are doing the proper testing or putting in place all the things that you need to address those differences. So that's why it's important to do a thorough analysis in the beginning. So in Canada, the classification is done, and there are 4 different classes under which products are classified. The regulatory pathway, as I discussed earlier, is that you would submit a medical device license application, and Health Canada would review the application and then issue a license. Of course, they also need you to comply with quality systems of Health Canada, which is similar to ISO 13485. There are very subtle differences, and those kinds of differences you can get audited for that and make sure that you're complying with whatever required by Health Canada. So let's look at poll question number 6.
Okay, so the question is, what does CE signify? And the options are: C stands for quality of device, C is symbol to state that the product meets all regulatory. Can you complete there, Parul, please?
Yeah, all regulatory requirements.
Okay, and the other one is C is symbol to state that the product meets all regulatory requirements.
Oh, I think it got repeated.
Identical. Right, the third one is not correct. Or all of the above, which I guess in this case would be the two options. Okay, most of the audience has responded. I think we can close the poll. I'm going to add up 2 and 3. So basically 30, 41, right? 30, 40, 41% of the audience believes C is symbol to state that product meets all regulatory, and 53% says all of the above, and only 6% says it stands for quality of device.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, the correct answer would be all of the above, because it does signify that the product is of certain quality and also meets all the regulatory requirements. I mean, of course, those statements might not be completely true by themselves, but if you take into account all of them together, then that all of the above option is the correct one. Okay, let's move on to the next. So in India, the classification of devices is, again, 4 classes, A, B, C, D. Regulatory bodies here are DCGI, that's the Drug Controller General of India, and under that they have CDSCO, which is a branch that regulates all medical devices. In India, there are notified devices and non-notified devices. So depending on whether or not your product falls under the notified category or the non-notified category, you will be subject to certain regulatory requirements. And of course, if you have a CE marking or if you have a 510K clearance from the FDA, it's much easier to enter into the Indian market. So steps for medical device registration in India, this is just like going over different steps that are required, but I wouldn't go into the details of this, but just an overview of the steps involved. Let's look at the poll question number 7.
Okay, so the question is, both Canada and the EU follow quality system standards of ISO 13485, and the options are true, only for class 2 and 3 devices, only for class 3 devices, or false. Parul, thank you for this very interactive presentation. I'm sure the audience is appreciating it. Most of our audience has responded. I think we can close the poll question. So 69% of the audience says true, 25% says only for class 2 and 3 devices, and only 6% says false. Back to you, Parul.
Thanks. Yes, so the correct answer is true. Both Canada and EU follow quality system standards of ISO 13485. There are subtle differences, like, you know, the quality manual will ask for certain things per Health Canada, which won't be asked in ISO 13485. But I would say that if you're complying with ISO 13485, it's a very broad standard that would cover most of the quality systems. Also, the auditor's style, whether it's 13485 or FDA QSR, would be a bit different. So you would have to prepare such documentation in order to satisfy them during audit. So that's a whole different topic in itself. But yes, for this one, both of them would recognize that standard. I'm sorry about that. So, okay, let's look at Chinese regulatory body. So in China, the regulatory body is the FDA. They have 3 classes. Class 1, 2, and 3. In China, they need appointment of an agent. They need testing according to different standards. They might also require clinical trials. Then you would submit an application to the CFDA. They would evaluate and finally issue approval letter. Let's look at poll question number 8.
And the question is, for medical devices in India, is local testing required for registration? And the options are yes, not mandatory, only foreign tests reports are accepted, no, foreign testing reports are generally accepted. Give a few seconds. Thank you everyone for participating, by the way. This makes it really good. Well, I think we can close the poll question. And so here are the thoughts of our audience. Again, for medical devices in India, is local testing required for registration? 60% says yes, 20% says not mandatory, and 20% says no. Foreign testing reports are generally accepted. Back to you, Parul.
Thank you, Chris. So local testing for medical devices in India, is local testing required for registration? The answer would be not mandatory, because see, as long as the testing is done in compliance to recognized harmonized standards, like for example, if your device needs electrical safety testing, and if it's tested according to IEC 60601, which is a recognized harmonized standard across different countries, then no, testing will not be required. Local testing won't be required. But only in certain cases where you are designing a device which is applicable only to the unique population of that country, then you might be asked to do a small clinical trial. But most likely, you know, you might be developing devices that are already applicable for US market or European market. Very few companies would make products that are applicable only to a particular country, and that to like a small population of patients. So yes, most likely the testing is all accepted in India, and it's recognized there as well. Okay, so here is a quick snapshot of different timelines country-wise. So you see in US, and this is just taking into account the class 2 devices. So US 510K, a traditional 510K would typically be reviewed within 90 days of submission. However, it could take longer if correct information is not submitted to the FDA. In Europe, it can take up to 1 to 2 months. So notified bodies would finish their review pretty quickly, but of course, like the initial preparation, getting quality systems in place, getting the technical file ready for review, all that takes time. In Canada, after it's been submitted to the Health Canada, it takes typically 3 months. In India, it's about 6 to 9 months. China takes a long time, and it's between 1 year to 3 years. And in China, the submission process itself is much faster if you have a US 510K, because you can leverage a lot of testing from there and use it for supporting your Chinese submission. So that's where regulatory strategy plays a really important role. So knowing what is the regulation in each and every country, and which country would be the best country to enter first, and how you can leverage a lot of things that you did for that country and use it for other countries, is something that needs to be thought through in the beginning. A plan needs to be made, and a cross-functional team needs to give their input into that. So that's why I would like to emphasize the importance of a regulatory strategy. So export-import, as I mentioned earlier, of course, export-import is an important factor to consider in regulatory and formulating a successful regulatory strategy. For example, if your product is an import product in the US, then you need to appoint an initial importer in US. And similarly, if you're exporting your product to the European market, then you need to appoint a the European authorized representative and a European agent over there. So these things need to be taken into account so that you can find the correct person and collaborate with the right organizations who would help you to enter these markets and facilitate your import and export process. So definitely take into account whether your product is going to be in the import or in the export category when you're going to sell it to a particular country. Now, pre-market and post-market requirements are also very important for formulating a regulatory strategy. So a regulatory strategy is very different for a pre-market stage and for a post-market stage. So if, for example, if your product is in the pre-market stage and you just want to do a regulatory submission to bring your product to the market, then the things that you would take into account would be totally different from when your product is in the post-market stage. So if you have a stent, or let's take an example of tonometer, for example, tonometer that's used for measuring intraocular eye pressure. So if you have that product and you're launching into the market for the first time, then you would need to do testing. You would need to have in place design controls. You would need to have claims and quality systems, all those things, and you would need to take into account which country you want to launch to, what claims you want to make, and what target population you are planning for that particular device. Whereas if it's already in the market, you know the target population, you know the countries where you're selling, and you're just making some design changes to it, then the regulatory strategy is pretty different, because then you have to evaluate what the design change could result in. Will my design change result in a new submission, or what things do I need to take into account whenever I'm making a design change? So when formulating your strategy, think about things from this standpoint also, whether your product is in pre-market stage or post-market stage. So aligning your regulatory strategy with your company goal is very important, and many a times marketing personnel will tell you that, okay, as a team we want to market the US market first, because we have the largest patient population in that market. But at the same time, you shouldn't just only prepare for selling in US, because many a times when you're selecting suppliers or other partners, you do have to take into account other country requirements. Are they going to be able to support you to bring your device to different countries like Europe, US, China, or India for that matter? And sometimes you might even want to consider parallel submissions. And I have worked on such scenarios where we have done parallel submissions for US, Europe, and China, and we have gotten through all three countries. And that was all because we did formulate a strong strategy in the beginning, and we foresaw all the things that we would need for each of those markets and how we could address each of those requirements by taking them into account in product development. So I mean, a thorough planning is really important, and making sure that your regulatory strategy is in alignment with your company short-term as well as long-term goals. So balancing between competing priorities, what I mean by this is that when you have competing priorities, like, you know, you might be involved in certain different things in the product development stage, you need to prioritize things depending on the risk they would have. So like deciding the right patient population and deciding the right target market is very important, and it should be the first priority in the product development phase. So definitely startups and other companies that are developing a new product, they would always have competing priorities, but it's important to balance between competing priorities based on the risk that you would be subject to if you don't attend to that particular decision, or if you don't make that decision. Leveraging individual expertise for a successful strategy, yes, is important, as I've been mentioning that we need to take into account opinion of someone with clinical background, someone with regulatory background, someone with R&D background. So when people of different backgrounds sit on a table, not literally sit on a table, but maybe even work on an Excel sheet together, they would be able to give their expert opinion and formulate a successful regulatory strategy that makes sense from every business aspect. So brainstorming and selecting the best path and best market, best target population is very important. Okay, I would like to take a quick case study. There is a hemodialysis equipment, and of course, we would like to decide, formulate a strong regulatory strategy for it. So for that, we would need to decide what should be the target market, what would be the indications for use and intended use, what is the risk associated with the device, what is the classification of device, whether it's in the imported status or exported status, and what product life cycle stage it is in currently. So we decided that the target market was US and Europe, and it would be class 2 in US and class 2B in Europe. For import-export, it would be exported to the Europe from US. So these were the questions that we answered in the beginning in order to formulate a regulatory strategy, and then this helped us in determining what type of testing we should do for this device, what type of requirements we need to comply with, and then we started taking those things into account while performing each and every activity at the company. So it helped in selecting the suppliers. So for example, since our target market was also Europe in addition to US, we selected suppliers that could help us in demonstrating RoHS compliance to the notified bodies, which is a requirement for European market. We also asked the suppliers if they could give us FCC certification for certain Bluetooth functionality in the device, which is a requirement for US market. So see how we decided the market and then started to incorporate those requirements of the target markets into the day-to-day activities and day-to-day decisions that we make at the company. So this really helped us in selecting the right suppliers at a very early stage. So later on, it was not like, oh shoot, we should have asked the supplier to give us FCC certificate. We don't have a supplier who can provide us FCC certificate. So things like that. And then consultants also, of course, very important. We selected people who have experience working with the notified body, and selection of the right notified body, the right European authorized representative is also important. And we made that choice early on. And then we also decided on the testing and was also supported by consultants on the same. What you need, we determined that we need 510K submission to enter the US market. For European market, we need to have a technical file. Then we started making sections of each of these documents and leveraged a lot of information from one application and used it for the other. And we already knew what sections we need to fill out and what type of testing we need to do. So it was very early that we took into account all those things and really helped us in shortening the time to the market. So the whole point is to definitely take the time to decide what your regulatory strategy would be, and jot down what would be your target market, what would be your target population, is your product to import, export status. So many things that you would take into account for formulating a strong regulatory strategy. So I would just quickly like to touch over the common pitfalls. Of course, planning for short term is something that we definitely want to avoid. If we want to launch to the US market in 6 months or in 1 year from now, we should foresee that do we really want to enter any other market after we do US market? If yes, then please do take into account other requirements early on so that you make sure that you would be able to provide the necessary information when needed. Improper supplier selection, which is again sort of related to the first point. If you don't take into account your long-term strategy, then you might not be able to select the right partners, whether it's supplier, consultants, or any other person for that matter. And incorrect testing, again, dependent on the requirements of a particular country. Inaccurate cost and resource allocation. So all these factors, as I've mentioned, should be taken into account for formulating a strategy so that you can avoid all the pitfalls. So that's about it that I wanted to talk about regulatory strategy. Thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Parul. Zintro members, feel free to contact Parul directly by reaching out to her profile. On behalf of Zintro and our over 180,000 members, thank you so much for sharing your insights. As I said, we're going to be sharing the recording of this presentation in the upcoming week with everyone, so stay tuned. If you'd like to host a webinar as well, reach out to us, please. This closes today's presentation. I wish you all a very nice day, and thank you very much for your attendance.